They did everything they were told to do. They worked hard. They showed up on time. They paid their bills. They raised families. They sacrificed vacations, skipped luxuries, and kept pushing through one exhausting year after another because they believed in one promise, that one day, after decades of work, they would finally be allowed to stop. That day was supposed to come at 65. For generations, that number meant something. It meant freedom. It meant rest. It meant waking up without an alarm clock, spending time with grandkids, taking walks in the morning, and finally enjoying the life you spent 40 years building. But for millions of older Americans, that promise never showed up, because turning 65 doesn't always mean retirement anymore. Sometimes it just means the end of one job and the beginning of another. A smaller job, a lower-paying job, a harder job than your body can handle, a job you never imagined doing at this stage of life. And that's the quiet reality for a growing number of people across America. They retired at 65, and they're still working. Not because they're bored, not because they just want to stay busy, not because they love standing on sore feet for 8 hours under fluorescent lights. They're working because they have to. And that says something deeply troubling about what retirement has become. There was a time when retirement actually looked like retirement. You worked, you saved, maybe you had a pension, maybe Social Security covered enough of the basics, and even if life wasn't luxurious, at least it was stable, at least you could breathe, at least you knew the hardest years were behind you. Now, that feeling is disappearing. Today, retirement often comes with a calculator in one hand and anxiety in the other, because the bills keep coming, the rent keeps rising, the groceries cost more, the prescriptions add up, the property taxes don't care how old you are, and the emergency expenses never stop showing up. So people who thought they had reached the finish line are suddenly forced to ask a painful question. Can I actually afford to stop working? And for many, the answer is no. That's the heartbreaking part. A lot of these people are not irresponsible. They are not lazy. They are not reckless spenders who wasted every paycheck. Many of them did what society told them to do. They worked for decades and still ended up here anyway. Because life is expensive. Because wages didn't stretch far enough. Because health problems happened. Because layoffs happened. Because divorce happened. Because inflation happened. Because one crisis after another chipped away at what they thought would protect them later. And by the time they reached 65, the money simply wasn't enough. That's how you end up seeing a 6, 8-year-old woman behind a grocery register. That's how you end up seeing a 72-year-old man delivering food in bad weather. That's how you end up seeing people with gray hair stocking shelves, greeting customers, cleaning buildings, answering phones, driving rideshare, and doing physically draining work long after they were supposed to be done. And what makes this even more painful is that many of them once believed retirement would be their reward. Think about that. You spend 40 or 50 years waking up early, commuting, standing, lifting, sitting in meetings, dealing with bosses, surviving stress, raising kids, paying off debt, and putting your own rest on hold because you believe someday it'll all slow down. You believe your later years will finally belong to you. But then 65 arrives, and nothing slows down. The paycheck stops or gets smaller. The expenses don't. The pressure stays. And suddenly, the so-called golden years start looking a lot like survival mode. That's the part people don't always understand. When younger people imagine retirement, they often picture peace. They picture a small house, a cup of coffee in the morning, maybe a garden, maybe some travel, maybe simple days with no deadlines. But peace costs money, and if you don't have enough of it, retirement becomes stressful fast, very fast. Because once your income becomes fixed, every price increase feels personal. Every trip to the grocery store becomes a reminder. Every utility bill becomes a warning. Every doctor visit becomes a calculation. Every unexpected expense becomes a threat. And when you're older, it's not easy to just bounce back. You can't always work longer hours. You can't always retrain for a brand new career. You can't always rely on your health. You can't always keep up with the pace of younger workers. So the choices become smaller, narrower, harder, That's why so many older Americans aren't working because they love the idea of staying productive. They're working because the alternative is terrifying. And once you understand that, you stop seeing these workers the same way. You stop assuming they just enjoy being active. You start seeing the pressure behind the smile, the fatigue behind the politeness, the fear behind the phrase, "Oh, I just like to keep busy." Because sometimes "I like to keep busy" is just a more comfortable way of saying, "I can't afford not to be here." For many people, the hardest part is not even the work itself. It's the feeling of starting over at an age when you thought you were finally finished. Imagine spending your entire adult life believing in a finish line. You hold on through hard years because you think one day you'll earn the right to rest. You tell yourself the stress is temporary. The early mornings are temporary. The back pain, the deadlines, the long shifts, the missed weekends, all of it is worth it because retirement is waiting at the end. And then you get there, only to realize the finish line moved. That kind of disappointment cuts deep, because this isn't just about money. It's about dignity. It's about expectation. It's about the emotional shock of realizing that after all those years of effort, you still don't feel safe enough to stop. Some people quietly re-enter the workforce and never tell anyone how bad things really are. They smile. They joke about being semi-retired. They say they were getting bored at home. They tell friends they just wanted extra spending money. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes those words are covering something much more painful. Sometimes they're embarrassed. Embarrassed that the savings went faster than expected. Embarrassed that Social Security doesn't stretch far enough. Embarrassed that they need to work again after telling everyone they had finally retired. Embarrassed that after a lifetime of responsibility, they still feel financially exposed. That shame often stays hidden, because in America, people love talking about success, but they don't always talk honestly about struggle, especially later in life. There's an unspoken expectation that by your mid-60s, you should have everything figured out. Your house should be paid off. Your debts should be gone. Your savings should be solid. You should be settled. But real life is messier than that. A lot of people entered retirement carrying burdens they were never able to put down. Some were still paying off mortgages. Some still had credit card debt. Some were helping children who couldn't make it on their own. Some were already dealing with chronic health issues. Some had lost years of income caring for a spouse or parent. Some had their savings drained by a single emergency. And emergencies don't ask whether you're close to retirement. They just happen. A surgery happens. A roof leaks. A car breaks down. A spouse gets sick. A prescription changes. A family member needs help. And just like that, the careful plan you built over decades begins to crack. That's why so many retirees end up taking jobs they never imagined doing. Not dream jobs, not meaningful passion projects, just whatever is available. Retail, customer service, delivery apps, clerical work, cleaning, security, warehouse support, part-time food service, school support roles, reception work. Jobs that are often physically tiring, emotionally draining, or both. And when you're 67, 72, or 78, even a simple job can feel much harder than people realize. Standing for hours is harder. Carrying things is harder. Learning new systems is harder. Commuting is harder. Recovering from a long shift is harder. The body changes, whether people want to admit it or not. Knees ache more. Hands stiffen. Energy drops faster. Sleep may not come as easily. Stress hits harder. So, when older workers return to jobs that demand patience, speed, and stamina, they are often paying a price that younger people don't fully see. And yet they keep showing up. That's what makes this so heavy. You're looking at people who already gave decades of their lives to work, and now they're being asked to keep going because the system around them became too expensive to leave. Sometimes people say, well, people are living longer now. Maybe working longer is just normal, but living longer is not the same as living comfortably. Yes, people may live more years, but those years still need food, housing, medication, utilities, transportation, and care. A longer life only helps if the extra years come with enough support to make them livable. Otherwise, a longer life can also mean a longer financial struggle. And that's the uncomfortable truth many people are beginning to see. Retirement is no longer just about reaching a certain age. It's about whether your money, your health, and your circumstances allow you to stop. For millions of Americans, age 65 is no longer a doorway into rest. It's just another number. Some retire on paper, but not in real life. They stop one full-time career, then pick up two part-time jobs. They leave the office but start driving deliveries. They leave the factory but begin working retail. They leave the school system but start answering phones somewhere else. In other words, they retire from one identity and enter another. And often, the second identity is more fragile than the first. Less pay, fewer benefits, less stability, less respect. That's another part people don't talk about enough. Many older workers aren't just working longer. They're working under worse conditions than before. They may have had decades of experience, skill, and knowledge in one field, only to end up in a job where none of that seems to matter. They go from being the experienced one to being treated like they're replaceable. They go from having a career to simply having shifts. That can be emotionally brutal, because deep down, many of them know this is not how the story was supposed to end. They were supposed to slow down. They were supposed to breathe easier. They were supposed to have time. Instead, they're watching the clock again. And maybe the saddest part is how common this has become. It's no longer surprising to see someone in their 70s working a register or standing behind a counter all day. We've seen it so often that people barely stop to question it, but maybe we should. Because when a society gets used to old age looking like exhaustion, that's not normal. That's a warning. Another reason so many retirees keep working is because retirement is no longer just about one person. It's about the whole family. That's something people often overlook. A lot of older Americans are not simply trying to support themselves. They're helping adult children who are struggling with rent, job instability, student debt, or the crushing cost of raising kids. Some are helping with grandchildren. Some are opening their homes to family members who need a place to stay. Some are caring for a spouse whose health has declined. Some are still recovering from financial decisions made years earlier when they were trying to keep everyone else afloat. And when you love your family, you rarely think of that help as a burden. You just do it. You step in. You cover the bill. You buy the groceries. You pay for the medication. You help with the rent. You say yes one more time, because that's what parents do. That's what grandparents do. That's what people do when the people they love are in trouble. But over time, that kind of support can quietly drain what was supposed to protect you later. Savings get smaller. Emergency funds disappear. Retirement accounts get tapped too early. Debt lingers longer than planned. Then age catches up, prices rise, and suddenly the person who spent their whole life helping others is the one standing in a work uniform, wondering why they still can't rest. That's why this issue is so much bigger than bad planning. People love easy explanations. They love to assume that if someone is still working at 70, they must have made terrible choices. But real life doesn't work that neatly. A lot of people made reasonable choices inside an economy that became harder and harder to survive. Housing got more expensive. Healthcare got more expensive. Insurance got more expensive. Food got more expensive. Everything got more expensive. But people's sense of security did not grow at the same speed. And when retirement becomes fragile, fear takes over. That fear shows up in quiet ways. It shows up when someone hesitates before turning on the heat. It shows up when a grocery trip becomes a math problem. It shows up when someone delays going to the dentist because they're worried about the cost. It shows up when a retiree says, "I'll be fine," but secretly knows one emergency could knock everything apart. That kind of fear changes the meaning of aging. Because getting older is already difficult enough without financial pressure sitting on your chest every morning. Aging comes with enough uncertainty on its own. Energy changes, health changes, mobility changes. Your world slowly asks more from you while giving you less margin for error. So when money is unstable on top of all that, retirement stops feeling like freedom. It starts feeling like exposure. That's why so many older workers describe their jobs in careful, softened language. They'll say they're keeping active. They'll say they didn't want to sit around. They'll say they wanted a little extra money. And sometimes those things are true, but sometimes those phrases are simply easier to say than the truth. The truth might be, my Social Security isn't enough. My rent is too high. My spouse got sick. My savings ran low. I don't feel safe unless I keep earning. And that last sentence is the one that should make everyone pause. Because retirement was supposed to be the phase of life where safety had already been earned. After decades of labor, people should not still feel one broken appliance away from panic. They should not feel guilty buying basic groceries. They should not feel trapped by every bill in the mailbox. They should not have to choose between rest and survival. And yet many do. That's why the modern image of retirement looks so different from the one people were raised to expect. It no longer automatically means peace, stability, and time. Often, it means uncertainty with a softer label. People retire from their main career, but they don't retire from financial stress. They don't retire from bills. They don't retire from responsibility. In many cases, they don't even retire from work. They just switch forms of work, from career work to survival work, from long-term employment to patchwork income, from professional identity to hourly necessity. And that shift can be deeply lonely, because once you reach a certain age, people assume you've already figured life out. They assume you're settled. They assume you're okay. Older people are often expected to appear strong, grateful, and low maintenance. Society doesn't always make much room for the possibility that someone in their late 60s or 70s may still be scared, overwhelmed, or financially cornered. So many suffer quietly. They keep smiling. They keep showing up. They keep saying they're fine. And behind all of that, they keep carrying stress that should have ended years ago. That's what makes this story so powerful. It's not just about older people working. It's about what happens when the promise of retirement becomes conditional. It's about what happens when rest becomes something only the fortunate can afford. It's about what happens when a society slowly gets used to seeing old age tied to labor instead of relief. Because once that becomes normal, something important has been lost. And if all of this sounds unsettling, it should. Because this is not just a story about retirement. It's a story about what happens when a lifetime of work no longer guarantees peace at the end of it. For younger people, this should be a wake-up call. Not because every future is doomed, and not because no one will ever retire comfortably again, but because the old assumptions don't hold the way they used to. Reaching 65 is no longer the same as reaching safety. The number is still there, but the meaning behind it has changed. That's why so many younger workers look at their parents and grandparents and feel a quiet fear. They see people who did everything right and still ended up working later than expected. They see older relatives stretching every Social Security check, worrying about groceries, putting off medical care, or taking part-time jobs just to stay ahead of monthly bills. They see people who should be resting, still living with the anxiety of earned income, scheduling shifts, and hoping their bodies can keep up. And once you see that, it becomes hard to believe the system will automatically protect you later. That fear is growing because the modern cost of living leaves less room for mistakes. A job loss hurts more. Rent hits harder. Healthcare costs cut deeper. Family emergencies ripple farther. And for many people, it doesn't take a lifetime of bad decisions to fall short in retirement. It can happen from just a few years of instability at the wrong time. That matters, because when a society starts treating retirement like a luxury instead of a normal stage of life, something is broken. Retirement should not be reserved only for people who were lucky enough to avoid illness, avoid layoffs, avoid divorce, avoid caregiving burdens, avoid inflation shocks, avoid helping struggling family members, and avoid every other real-world event that drains money over time. That is not a realistic standard. That is survival disguised as personal responsibility. And yet that's the standard many older people feel judged against. If they're still working, people assume they failed. But maybe the deeper truth is that the system failed them. Maybe the problem is not that older people didn't work hard enough. Maybe the problem is that hard work alone is no longer enough to guarantee security. Maybe the rules changed while they were busy playing by them. And once you understand that, the image of an older worker starts to look very different. You don't just see a cashier. You see someone who has already spent decades contributing. You don't just see a delivery driver with gray hair. You see someone whose retirement years were quietly taken over by financial pressure. You don't just see an older woman standing behind a counter. You see someone who may have already carried a family, a household, and a lifetime of responsibility before clocking into that shift. There is dignity in that, real dignity. Because no matter how unfair the situation is, many of these people keep going. They keep showing up. They keep adapting. They keep finding ways to survive in a world that got more expensive than anyone expected. They keep carrying burdens with a strength most people don't fully recognize. But dignity should not be used as an excuse to ignore the problem. Yes, it is admirable when older people stay resilient. Yes, it is admirable when they keep moving forward. Yes, it is admirable when they refuse to give up. But admiration is not enough. People should have the option to stop. That's the key word, option. There is a big difference between a 70-year-old who works because she enjoys the routine and a 70-year-old who works because she's terrified of falling behind on rent. There is a big difference between staying active and staying desperate. There is a big difference between purpose and pressure. Too often, those differences get blurred together. People say, work keeps you young. Maybe sometimes it does. People say, it's good to stay busy. Maybe sometimes it is. But none of those phrases should be used to hide what's really happening when older Americans keep working because retirement simply doesn't pay enough to live. Because this is not really about being busy. It's about not being able to afford peace. And maybe that is the most painful part of all. After 40 or 50 years of labor, people should not have to earn rest twice. They should not have to prove again and again that they deserve a life with fewer alarms, fewer deadlines, fewer aches, and fewer financial fears. They should not have to spend their later years wondering whether they can afford to get sick, whether they can afford to fix the car, whether they can afford groceries next month, or whether they need to look for yet another job just to stay stable. That's not the retirement people imagined. That's not the retirement people were promised. So, the next time you see an older worker scanning groceries, stocking shelves, answering phones, delivering meals, or cleaning offices late in life, take a second look, because you may not be looking at someone who chose work over rest. You may be looking at someone who spent a lifetime working and still never got the chance to truly stop. Someone who reached 65 and discovered that the bills were still waiting. Someone who thought retirement would finally bring relief, only to find another uniform, another shift, another long day on tired legs. Someone who followed the script but didn't get the ending. They retired at 65, and they're still working.